The impossible challenge. Dr. Sarah Chen stood before the crystalline form of the Lumini ambassador, her presentation hovering in the air between them. The being's faceted surface caught the light from her holographic display, sending rainbow refractions dancing across the pristine walls of the interspecies cultural exchange facility on Europa. "So you want to do what exactly?" The translator rendered the Lumini's thoughts into crisp English, though Sarah could detect a note of confusion in its harmonics. "I want to run duom on one of your people," Sarah replied, trying to keep her voice steady. She practiced this pitch 100 times in front of her lab team, but saying it out loud to an actual Lumini still felt absurd, with their consent, of course. The ambassador's crystalline form shifted slightly, a sign Sarah had learned indicated deep thought among their species. "The ancient human entertainment program. The one your people are obsessed with making function on every possible computational device." Sarah nodded eagerly. "Exactly. You see, when we discovered that your species naturally processes and stores data within your crystalline matrices, I realized we had an opportunity to attempt something truly revolutionary." She gestured to her display, which showed the classic demons and corridors of the 1993 game. "Duum isn't just a game to us anymore. It's become a benchmark for human ingenuity, a challenge we set ourselves to push the boundaries of what's possible." The ambassador's surface rippled with patterns of light, their equivalent of laughter. "Dr. Chen, while I appreciate human creativity, our people are not computer hardware to be programmed." "Of course not," Sarah rushed to explain. "That's exactly what makes this project so fascinating. We've learned that your species can voluntarily incorporate external data patterns into your consciousness. You already use this ability for your own art forms, creating those beautiful internal light shows. This would simply be an adaptation of that same principle." She pulled up another display, this one showing the preliminary research her team had conducted. "We've already developed a method to translate the game's core systems into light patterns similar to those your people naturally process. It would be completely safe, non-invasive, and entirely under the volunteers' control." The ambassador studied the data scrolling before them. "And the purpose of this experiment would be..." Sarah took a deep breath. This was the crucial part. Cultural exchange. Understanding. Every species in the galaxy sees humans as reckless innovators, always pushing boundaries that shouldn't be pushed. But that drive to attempt the impossible, to find new ways to solve old problems, it's fundamental to who we are. This project isn't just about running a game. It's about showing that human creativity and alien biology can work together to create something entirely new. The crystalline being was silent for a long moment, light patterns shifting deeply within their structure. "Your reputation for attempting the improbable is well earned, Dr. Chen. The mere fact that you conceived of this project proves that point." They paused, and Sarah held her breath. "I will present your proposal to my people. Perhaps some of our younger members will be intrigued by the possibility." Sarah barely contained her excitement. "Thank you, Ambassador. I promise you won't regret this." As she gathered her materials to leave, the ambassador added, "Dr. Chen, one question. Why duom specifically? Surely there are simpler programs you could attempt first." Sarah smiled, because everyone said it couldn't be done. And if there's one thing humans love more than running duom on things, it's proving the impossible possible. Back in her lab, Sarah's team waited anxiously for news. The lab was a contrast of cutting-edge human technology and adapted Lumini light processing equipment, all centered around a simple desktop computer running the original duom. "Well," Dr. Marcus Wong, her chief programmer, nearly knocked over his coffee in excitement as she entered. "They're considering it," Sarah replied, dropping into her chair with a mixture of relief and anticipation. "Now we just need to make sure all our theories actually work in practice." She pulled up their current challenge, translating the game's binary code into the complex light patterns that the Lumini used for information storage. The patterns on her screen looked like abstract art, beautiful but incomprehensible to human eyes. if we can pull this off. Her quantum mechanics expert, Dr. Yuki Tanaka, mused, it won't just be about running Doom. We'll have proven that biological and digital systems can be directly integrated in entirely new ways. The medical applications alone. First things first, Sarah interrupted, though she shared Yuki's excitement about the broader implications. We need to make sure we can actually do this without causing our volunteer any discomfort. The last thing we want is to give anyone ammunition to shut us down. The team worked late into the night, refining their convergent algorithms and running simulation after simulation. Sarah knew they were racing against more than just time. They were racing against skepticism, against the ingrained belief that humans were too reckless with their innovations. As she stared at the swirling light patterns on her screen, Sarah thought about all the times throughout history when humans had been told something was impossible. Running Duom on a living conscious crystalline being might seem ridiculous to some, but to her, it represented everything that made humanity special. The creativity to imagine it, the audacity to attempt it, and the determination to make it work. Tomorrow, they would begin the real work. And maybe, just maybe, they would add another chapter to humanity's long history of doing the impossible. First contact, first failure. The young Lumini volunteer called themselves Spark, a name chosen specifically for interaction with humans. Their crystalline form was smaller than the ambassadors, with a distinctive blue tinge that seemed to pulse with barely contained excitement. I studied human gaming culture extensively. Spark's thoughts translated as they settled into the specially designed containment field in Sarah's lab. The concept of play as a form of narrative interaction is fascinating. Sarah adjusted the calibration of their light pattern translators, while Marcus ran final checks on their conversion algorithms. We'll start small today, she explained, just trying to establish a basic data connection. No actual gameplay yet. Disappointing, but understandable. Spark pulsed with good humor. Though I must admit, I'm eager to experience this shooting demons concept firsthand. The lab had been transformed over the past week. The walls were now lined with specialized light sensors and projectors, creating a controlled environment for their experiments. At the center, Spark hovered in a field of precisely tuned energy that would help facilitate the data transfer. Beginning initial pattern transmission, Yuki announced from her station, starting with basic geometric shapes to establish baseline compatibility. The air around Spark filled with delicate patterns of light, carefully crafted to match the Lumini's natural data processing frequencies. For a moment, everything seemed perfect. The patterns flowed toward Spark's crystalline form, and their surface began to ripple in response. Then everything went wrong. Spark's form suddenly flared with brilliant light, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. The patterns they were transmitting shattered, dissolving into chaos. Alarms blared as their equipment registered massive feedback spikes. "Shut it down," Sarah shouted, already rushing toward Spark. "Are you all right?" The Lumini's form gradually settled back to its normal luminescence. "I am. Functional." They transmitted, though their thought patterns seemed shaky. "That was intense. Your data patterns, they're too rigid, too structured. It's like trying to swallow a crystal whole instead of letting it dissolve naturally." Sarah frowned, making rapid notes as Yuki and Marcus worked to analyze what had gone wrong. "We modeled these patterns on your own information storage systems." "Ah," Spark interrupted, their form rippling with what Sarah had learned was their equivalent of a rueful smile. "You modeled them on our storage patterns, but that's not how we process new information. Would you try to eat a database?" The lab fell silent as the implications sank in. "We've been approaching this all wrong," Marcus said slowly. "We've been treating the Lumini consciousness like computer hardware, trying to write data directly to storage. But consciousness doesn't work like that, for any species. We need to translate the game into an experience, not just data," Sarah realized, excitement building despite their failure. "Spark, how do your people share new experiences with each other?" The Lumini's form brightened. Through resonance, we create patterns that evoke the experience, letting each individual's consciousness interpret and integrate them naturally. It's more organic than your direct data transfer. Sarah turned to her team. New approach. Instead of trying to translate the game's code directly, we need to break it down into basic experiential components: movement, space, interaction. We need to create a framework that Spark's consciousness can interpret and interact with naturally. That's going to take a complete redesign of our conversion protocols, Yuki pointed out. We'll have to start from scratch. Then we start from scratch, Sarah said firmly. This was never going to be easy, but now we know where we went wrong, and that's progress. Over the next several hours, they worked closely with Spark, learning how the Lumini naturally processed and interpreted new experiences. Sarah was fascinated to discover that their consciousness worked in ways both utterly alien and surprisingly familiar to human thought patterns. It's like the difference between learning a language through rote memorization versus immersion, Spark explained, as they helped the team understand their cognitive processes. Your first approach was like trying to memorize a dictionary. What we need is more like having a conversation. As the day drew to a close, Sarah sat at her desk, surrounded by new equations and theoretical frameworks. Their first attempt had failed spectacularly, but she couldn't help feeling they were actually closer to their goal. They had learned more about Lumini consciousness in one day of failure than in months of theoretical research. You know, Marcus said as they were packing up, there's a certain irony here. We're trying to run Duon on an alien consciousness, but to do it, we first have to learn to think like aliens ourselves. Sarah smiled. That's humanity for you. We set out to do something impossible, and along the way, we end up expanding our understanding of what's possible in ways we never expected. Spark, who had been quietly observing their end-of-day routines, pulsed with curiosity. I've noticed that humans often learn more from failure than success. Is this normal for your species? Very, Sarah replied. In fact, some might say it's our superpower. We fail, we learn, we adapt, and we try again. And again. And again, until we succeed. Then, Spark's form brightened with determination. I look forward to failing with you again tomorrow. The breakthrough. 3 weeks of failures had taught Sarah's team more than a year of theoretical research. Their lab walls were now covered with complex mathematical models describing the intersection of human digital code and Lumini consciousness. Each failed attempt had added another piece to their understanding, but they still hadn't managed to successfully interface the game with Spark's consciousness. Sarah sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by holographic displays showing their latest test results, when Yuki burst into the lab at 3 a.m. I figured it out, she exclaimed, her hair disheveled and eyes wild with a particular madness that only comes from too much caffeine and a sudden revelation. We've been trying to translate the game into something the Lumini can understand. But what if we're still thinking too literally? Sarah blinked at the streams of data Yuki was frantically projecting into the air. What do you mean? Look at this. Yuki pulled up their brain-scanned data from human players engaged in Duom alongside readings from Spark's consciousness during their attempts. When humans play Duom, we're not processing raw code. Our brains create a mental model of the game space, a kind of virtual reality that we interact with. What if instead of trying to translate the game's code, we translate the experience of playing it? Sarah stood slowly, her mind racing with possibilities. You're saying we should create a framework that lets Spark's consciousness generate its own version of the game space. Exactly. Yuki's hands flew over her controls, bringing up new models. Look at how Lumini process spatial information. They naturally create complex three-dimensional models in their consciousness when navigating space. If we could provide the basic parameters of Dune's levels, their consciousness would naturally construct a navigable environment. Sarah finished, excitement building. Spark wouldn't need to process our code because they'd be creating their own version of the game space. They worked through the night, reconfiguring their entire approach. When Spark arrived the next morning, they found the lab transformed. The rigid data transfer systems had been replaced with a more organic array of light sculptors designed to suggest rather than impose. Today feels different, Spark observed, their crystalline form reflecting the new equipment setup. Today we stop trying to make you think like a computer, Sarah explained, and start letting you play like a Lumini. The new protocol began with simple spatial concepts, the basic geometry of Doom's first level translated into pure spatial relationships. Instead of trying to transfer the exact layout, they provided Spark with the fundamental rules of the space: walls, corridors, rooms. Spark's form began to pulse with increasing brightness as they processed the information. I can sense it. Not like your digital maps, but I'm creating the space within my consciousness. It feels natural, like growing a new facet. Sarah and her team watched in amazement as their sensors showed Spark's consciousness constructing a perfect three-dimensional model of E1M1, the first level of Doom. But it wasn't an exact copy. It was something new, something that existed at the intersection of human game design and Lumini spatial awareness. Now for the hard part, Marcus said, initiating the next phase: character interaction and game mechanics. They had redesigned the entire combat system based on their understanding of how Lumini perceived cause and effect. Instead of direct translations of shooting and damage, they created conceptual frameworks for conflict and resolution that would make sense to a crystalline consciousness. This is remarkable, Spark transmitted as they began to grasp the game mechanics. The demons, I'm not seeing them as your digital sprites, but I understand them as oppositional forces within the space I've constructed. And the weapons, they pulsed with what Sarah had learned was their equivalent of laughter. They're like focused thoughts, reshaping the reality I'm generating. The lab erupted in celebration as their sensors confirmed what they were seeing. Spark wasn't just running Doom, they were experiencing it in a way uniquely adapted to their consciousness while remaining true to the game's essential nature. Try moving through the level, Sarah suggested, barely containing her excitement. Spark's form shifted and pulsed as they navigated their internally generated game space. This is nothing like I expected, they transmitted. It's not like processing external data at all. I'm creating and exploring simultaneously. The space exists because I understand it should exist, and the interactions occur because I comprehend their necessity within the framework you've provided. You're not just running Doom, Yuki said softly, watching the readings from Spark's consciousness. You're dreaming it. That simple observation changed everything. They hadn't succeeded by forcing a human game to run on alien hardware. They'd created something entirely new, a bridge between human and Lumini ways of experiencing interactive entertainment. As Spark enthusiastically explored their new capability, Sarah noticed something unexpected in their readings. The processing patterns you're generating. They're not just staying within the game framework. They're creating new connections, new ways of thinking. Spark pulsed with excitement. Yes, I'm beginning to understand why humans find this so compelling. It's not just about the game itself. It's about the joy of experiencing something new, of learning to think in new ways. This isn't just running Doom. It's evolution through play. The implications were staggering. They had set out to run a game on an alien consciousness and instead discovered a new form of cross-species cognitive development. But as Sarah watched her team's celebrating faces and Spark's joyful pulses of light, she realized something else. They had proven that the most human trait of all, the desire to attempt the impossible, could bridge even the gap between carbon and crystal. Running against time, the success with Spark spread through the scientific community like a shockwave. Within days, Sarah's lab was flooded with messages, some congratulatory, others deeply concerned. But it was the arrival of Dr. Helena Maxwell from the Interspecies Ethics Committee that made Sarah's stomach sink. Dr. Chen. Maxwell's hologram flickered in Sarah's office, her expression severe. You've created quite a stir. running unauthorized consciousness-altering experiments on ascension species. With their full consent, Sarah interrupted. And all protocols were designed by you. For an unprecedented procedure, Maxwell cut in. We've received formal complaints from the Regellian Science Council. They're concerned that you're recklessly endangering Lumini consciousness for, what was it? Ah yes, frivolous entertainment purposes. Sarah fought to keep her voice level. If they'd actually read our results, they'd see that we've discovered an entirely new framework for cross-species cognitive interaction. The game was just the beginning. The beginning of what? Maxwell's hologram leaned forward. Of humans experimenting on alien consciousness. Of recklessly pushing boundaries without considering the consequences. The committee is convening an emergency session. Until then, all experiments are suspended. After the hologram faded, Sarah sat in silence, her mind racing. They were so close to something revolutionary. Spark had started showing signs of enhanced cognitive processing in areas completely unrelated to the game. Their ability to understand and interpret human concepts had increased exponentially. Her lab team gathered around as she shared the news. They can't just shut us down, Marcus protested. We're on the verge of something incredible. Watch me. Spark pulsed from their containment field, their attempt at human idiom bringing a brief smile to everyone's faces. I can demonstrate the cognitive benefits. No, Sarah said firmly. We can't risk them claiming we're manipulating you. We need to prove this is safe and beneficial in a way they can't ignore. Yuki pulled up their latest data. Look at these patterns. The way Spark's consciousness creates and maintains the game space. It's not just processing, it's genuine cognitive evolution. Their mind is learning to think in entirely new ways while remaining fundamentally Lumini. That's it. Sarah straightened. We need to show them it's not about the game at all. Spark, remember how you described it? Evolution through play. We're not changing Lumini consciousness. We're giving it new ways to grow. They worked frantically through the night, preparing their presentation for the committee. Sarah knew they needed more than just data. They needed to make the bureaucrats understand what they'd actually achieved. The emergency session convened the next morning. Sarah stood before the holographic panel of stern faces, Spark hovering silently beside her. Distinguished committee members, she began. I know you're concerned about the ethics of our experiment. But what we've discovered goes far beyond running a game on alien hardware. We found a way to create genuine cognitive bridges between species. She gestured to her displays, showing the evolution of Spark's consciousness patterns. The Lumini naturally process information through light patterns. We didn't change that. Instead, we created a framework that lets them use that natural ability in new ways. It's like teaching someone a new language. You're not changing how their brain works. You're giving it new tools to work with. And these tools involve shooting demons, one committee member asked skeptically. The game is just a method. Spark transmitted, their form pulsing with calm confidence. Through it, I've gained new ways of thinking, new ways of understanding both my own consciousness and yours. Watch. Spark's form began to glow, and suddenly the room was filled with a stunning display of light patterns. But these weren't the usual Lumini artistic expressions. They were a perfect three-dimensional representation of human neural patterns during problem-solving tasks. I can now perceive and replicate how your minds work, Spark explained as the committee stared in amazement. Not because my consciousness was altered, but because I learned to create new cognitive frameworks through play. Through your game, I learned to think in ways my species never considered, not by changing what I am, but by expanding what I can be. Sarah watched the committee's expressions shift from skepticism to wonder. This isn't about doom, she pressed her advantage. It's about proving that even species as different as humans and Lumini can find ways to grow together. We're not changing anyone. We're building bridges. Maxwell leaned forward, her earlier hostility replaced by cautious interest. And you believe this method could be applied to other forms of cross-species understanding. We're already seeing applications in translation, cultural exchange, even educational theory. Sarah nodded. The game was just our proof of concept. What we've really created is a framework for voluntary cognitive evolution through shared experience. The committee deliberated for hours. Sarah and her team waited anxiously, knowing that more than just their project hung in the balance. This could be the beginning of a new era in interspecies relations, or the end of it. Finally, Maxwell's hologram reappeared. Dr. Chen, the committee has reached a decision. Your project may continue, under oversight. But she held up a hand to forestall their celebration. We want to expand its scope. If this truly represents a breakthrough in cross-species cognitive development, it needs to be properly studied and documented. Sarah felt a weight lift from her shoulders, even as her mind began racing with new possibilities. They hadn't just saved their project. They'd opened the door to something much bigger. Spark pulsed with quiet satisfaction. Humans, they transmitted with what Sarah swore was fondness, always turning play into progress. 6 months after the committee hearing, Sarah stood in the newly inaugurated Cognitive Exchange Center, watching as a group of young Lumini interfaced with various human gaming experiences. The original Duome experiment had evolved into something far beyond her initial vision. They're attempting something called Minecraft today. Spark, now the official liaison between human and Lumini researchers, pulsed beside her. The concept of building worlds rather than exploring them has captured our younger generation's imagination. The center hummed with activity. What had started as a single experiment now occupied an entire facility, with research teams studying everything from enhanced translation protocols to new forms of artistic expression that blended human and Lumini sensibilities. Did you ever think, Sarah asked, watching a particularly enthusiastic Lumini construct elaborate crystalline structures within their mental version of Minecraft, that trying to run Duome would lead to all this? Spark's form shimmered with amusement. Humans have a saying about butterfly effects, do they not? Though in this case, perhaps we should call it the demon effect. The joke was interrupted by excited pulses from the research area. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was working with a group of Lumini educators who had adapted the cognitive framework for teaching purposes. They had discovered that complex scientific concepts could be translated into experiential models that both species could understand simultaneously. Look at this, Yuki called them over, pointing to her displays. We're seeing unprecedented levels of information retention and conceptual understanding. The Lumini students are learning quantum mechanics through direct experiential modeling, and human students are using modified VR interfaces to learn alongside them. But it wasn't just education. In another section of the facility, Marcus was working with a team developing new forms of entertainment that could be experienced by both species simultaneously. They called it shared dreaming. Interactive experiences that existed somewhere between human games and Lumini consciousness sculptures. The Regellians have officially requested to join the project, Dr. Maxwell announced, walking up to their group. The former skeptic had become one of their strongest advocates after seeing the results. Apparently, their philosophers are particularly interested in how this might apply to their metamorphic consciousness structures. Sarah felt a familiar thrill of excitement. Each new species that joined the project brought their own unique ways of thinking, their own cognitive challenges to solve. What had started as a seemingly impossible challenge, running Duome on an alien consciousness, had evolved into a revolution in how species could learn from and understand each other. We're getting reports from the medical research team. Marcus joined them, tablet in hand. The cognitive frameworks we developed are showing promise in treating certain forms of trauma and neural disorders. It turns out that learning to think in new ways can help heal old wounds. Of course it does, Spark pulsed thoughtfully. Your games taught us that failure is not an end, but a step toward victory. That pain can be overcome, that darkness can be fought, that even the most demon-haunted spaces can be conquered with persistence and the right tools. Sarah watched as a young human researcher excitedly explained the concept of powered-ups to a fascinated group of Lumini students. The crystalline beings were creating their own interpretations of the concept, turning it into something that blended human gaming mechanics with Lumini consciousness enhancement techniques. "You know what the best part is?" she said, smiling at the scene. "We're still just at the beginning. Every new species that joins us brings new ways of thinking, new challenges to solve. We're not just building bridges between different forms of consciousness anymore. We're creating entirely new ways of being conscious. Humanity's greatest gift," Spark transmitted warmly, "is not your technology or your games. It's your inability to accept limitations, your constant drive to turn impossible into not impossible yet." As if to emphasize the point, alarms began blaring from the development lab. Sarah rushed over, expecting a problem, only to find the team celebrating. They had successfully adapted their framework for silicon-based consciousness, opening the door to true artificial intelligence that could think in ways that blended organic and digital processing. "Game over." Marcus grinned, reading her expression. Sarah shook her head, watching as human, Lumini, and now possibly digital consciousness learned to dance together in ways no one had ever imagined possible. "No," she smiled. "I think we're just getting to the good part." In the center of the facility, a holographic display still ran the original Duum, a reminder of where it all began. But now it was surrounded by countless new forms of cross-species experiences, each one a testament to what could happen when one species dared to imagine the impossible and another species dared to help make it real. "Ready Player 2. Spark pulsed questioningly, using the human gaming phrase they had grown fond of. "Ready Player Everyone," Sarah corrected, watching as the future unfolded before them, one impossible achievement at a time.